Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of the ABC of Contemporary Capital with David Harvey, hosted here at the People's Forum. If you have questions during class today, you can put it into the YouTube chat. And I also want to invite everybody to a 3-session course that is going to be put on by the International People's Assembly that you can also follow along live on their YouTube, and I'll put that into the chat as well. It is a very timely and important course called NATO versus Peace. It's a political education session through the International People's Assembly. It will be held on 3 Wednesdays from March 23rd until April 6th. And it's a discussion on what's happening in Ukraine and really what does it mean for people in struggle against imperialism across the world. So I hope that you're able to join these sessions, and regardless, they will be live streamed on the International People's Assembly YouTube. With that, I will pass it off to David for today's class.
Okay, well, welcome in these troubled times, and I'm very happy to hear that we can do something about NATO. NATO has never been my favorite organization. I've always seen it as a kind of an excuse for the militarization of the global economy at the expense of much of the world, to the profit of a small part of the world. But we're now in this kind of crazy sort of situation where, in order to deal with somebody like Putin, you probably need NATO to deal with him. And I was reminded of my grandmother in World War II, who was very anti-Winston Churchill. And I was very young, and I was standing in a queue with her, and she was going on about that bugger Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill, of course, is supposed to be a great hero of the times, but this was the middle of World War II, and she was going on and on and on about that bugger Winston Churchill. And somebody said to her something like, well, you know, this is not appropriate, he's helping us, and Hitler's a rotten bugger. And she said, yeah, she said, Hitler's a rotten bugger, and it'll take one rotten bugger to get rid of another rotten bugger, and after this war is over, we're going to make sure all the rotten buggers are gone. You know, so I thought this was a very kind of a dialectical way of looking at the situation then. And it seems appropriate right now that we unfortunately need some sort of military power to stop Putin. But then after, if and when he is stopped, then one of the things we have to do is to make sure that the whole of capitalism gets disarmed, if you like, and we get out of this military and militarization that's actually dominated global capitalism since World War II. So anyway, though, this all kind of now. But this week we're in session 7, and we're going to discuss the writings from session 6. And so we'll start off looking at the equalization of the profit rate and the consequences of that. Some people seem to suggest, and thank you, by the way, for some of the commentaries on the sort of option, comment on the annotation option, about clarifying the language and clarifying the concepts. That's very useful to me, so thank you very much for that. But some people seem to be a little kind of confused by this, the general idea that the economy is working on the principle of from each capitalist according to the labor they employ, and to each capitalist according to the capital they advance. And this is a principle which actually operates in many spheres. And so I thought it would be useful just to take one which is right around us all of the time, just to illustrate the point. The United States is a federal system, but there are requirements of that federal system, and there are entitlements that everybody in the United States has, entitlements of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Now, the question arises as to how are those entitlements funded, and who contributes to the funding. And if you look very carefully, you'll find that places like Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York and California contribute to the pot of social security far more per capita than they get back. In other words, these economies are subsidizing the whole of the US economy. And places like Arkansas and Kentucky and Missouri and so on are actually receiving far more in federal benefits than they actually contribute. So this is a situation that's from each capital, from each state according to the wealth of the state, to each state according to the needs in that state for Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare. And so this is a lopsided setup. And you sometimes find politicians in New York State saying, well, one of these days we're going to start to say to the federal government, give us back exactly what we contribute. And now, if you want to know what a system of that sort looks like, then you would look at Social Security arrangements in Europe, which is very interesting because each country in Europe has its own Social Security system. There's not a federal system, it's not federalized. Whereas in the United States, everybody gets the same amount of Social Security once you've qualified for the benefits. It's an equality principle. So it's spread across the United States equally, even though the contribution to the fund is not equal. But in Europe, that doesn't happen. So that, for example, I have a close colleague in Greece who retired a little while ago, and for 2 or 3 years, I think it was, couldn't get his retirement benefits, which in this country would be equivalent to not being able to get your Social Security benefits. He couldn't get his pension benefits for 2 years or 3 years after he retired, because Greece was in a financial crisis, and Greece is a sort of an independent entity in terms of its Social Security system. So the Europeans have different Social Security systems from different states, and therefore they can get into messes of that kind. In this country, that cannot happen. That because of the federal structure and the way the federalism works, basic Social Security payments are available, everybody at the same rate everywhere, provided you qualify. And there's an equality of that, whereas there's an inequality of contribution. But the crazy thing about this is that those states which are most antagonistic to federal interventions in the economy, places like Arkansas and Kentucky and all the rest of it, are actually the ones who benefit most from this form of federal intervention. So they're anti the state, whereas people in New York are not so anti the federal state. They are some, but not in the same way that people are anti the federal state in many of these other states. But the states who are anti the federal government are actually benefiting most from this arrangement, and those that are least antagonistic to the federal government benefit least from it. So this is the crazy kind of political thing. But this is, I think, an interesting example of contributions being set up in a certain way and benefits being set up in an alternative way. And what Marx is saying is that this is how the market works. And the equalization of the profit rate does this. And so the equalization of the profit rate does not end up benefiting everybody equally. In fact, it benefits different states and companies and sectors differentially according to their capital intensity, by which I mean according to the gap between the capital they advance and the labor they employ. So this is a very different view of the free market, because the free market is generally viewed as being egalitarian and being and unbiased. But what I think is interesting historically is usually the biggest people arguing for market freedoms and the free market in general are usually those who are most capital intensive. In other words, it's those entities that most benefit from freedom who kind of pursue it as a policy. So when the United States kind of started to go on about the free market and the free market and the free market after the 1980s or so, it was about promoting a world in which there would be much more equalization of the rate of profit and much more subsidy from the labor-intensive economies in the world towards the capital-intensive economies in the world. Now, the United States has a mixed economy, but generally speaking, it's much more capital-intensive than most other economies in the world. And so the benefits that flowed to the United States through this mechanism. And the important thing about this mechanism is that you don't see it. And if you, reading this, have difficulty seeing it, then it is generally disguised from everybody. Everybody will have a difficulty in seeing it. And because you have a difficulty of seeing it, it operates in a manner which is unchallenged. I mean, to challenge the freedom of the market on principle of this kind is actually quite a stunning thing to do, and that's what Marx is trying to set up. But it's not being followed through very well for a variety of reasons, and including all this incredible debate about, you know, are we really talking about the relationship between values and market prices and all those kinds of things, which was a huge debate within Marxism, but also beyond Marxism. I mentioned Paul Samuelson sort of talking about this because of this debate that went on in the 1960s. But so this is I think a rather important idea, and one which is hard to make visible. And so I'm trying to make it visible, and it's not always easy. If people don't often get it, they kind of go, "What? I really don't understand how this can happen." But I think the example of the federalized system in the United States, of the granting of social security arrangements and so on, that's a very neat example of the difference between contribution and benefit. And what Marx is doing is saying, well, this is what a free market does. Free market is not a good and balanced thing. It's this unbalanced thing, and I think that unbalance is actually terribly important, because in a way it's a disguised form of imperialism. It says, in effect, I mean, the article I mentioned, a sort of quote from Michael Roberts, who I usually disagree with, but on this is very important. He was kind of saying, we haven't appreciated how much imperialism is actually worked out through freedom of the market. And that when the World Bank and the IMF and everybody else and all of the capitalist think tanks preach freedom of the market and say it's egalitarian and all the rest of it. No, it's not. Its consequences are inegalitarian, but they're largely disguised. And I think this is the kind of the clever part of Marx's argument, that he's trying to reveal and bring out. But like I say, it's a bit hard to communicate it, and I don't know whether I communicated it okay. Some people commented and suggested made suggestions for making the argument clearer. So thank you very much for that. I'll take those comments into account if and when I revise this whole thing and make it sort of more of a public document. But anyway, so there are many other things going on in this section. So people maybe have got some questions or observations they want to make about it. Any kind of comments? Do people get the argument okay?
I'll ask a question. Hello, Professor. As you start off with the conundrum that what is the source of profit if you're employing a minimal amount of laborers? I mean, I think that makes sense to me as a place to start, because it's both confusing at first, but then also something that can be cleared up without too much trouble. But from that to as you say, that the equalization of exchange, it transfers, like, it's not just an equalization, right? It's not a balancing. It actually, if things, without the equalization of exchange, the labor intensive portions of the global market would actually be the wealthiest, presumably. So it's a sort of wholesale, movement of the wealth to the, and then would that work? Would because I've lost track of the equalization of profit, there's two pieces. There's the equalization of profit, and there's the shift from one sector of the whole market to another. Are those two things, would the equalization of profit by itself be functional if it wasn't for the mass movement of capital from labor intensive to capital intensive regions?
I think, well, the movement of capital towards the labor and towards the capital intensive regions is is part of the picture. But if it all ends up in the capital intensive regions, I mean, if you all end up in the regions where there's absolutely no employment of labor at all, then the system would break down. What in effect happens here is that capital does move from, say, Greece to Germany or something. It does make that move, but insofar as it makes that move and it all starts to become capital intensive, then there's the problem of where's the value coming from. So at that point, the question is who's going to then pick up on industrialization? And of course, what you see historically is this, that during the 19th century, those economies that were industrializing with large labor forces were the premier economies. It was Britain and the United States and Germany and all the rest of it. What began to happen from the 1930s onwards, and it became very much more the case after 1945, was we start to see industrialization moving to labor surplus areas. So you take Bangladesh, for example, or Mexico or something like that. So capital's moving there because there's the labor there. And individual capitalists are making a lot of money out of that in Mexico or in Bangladesh. But the benefits that came from industrialization, which used to be there in the 19th and early 20th century, are no longer there. In fact, if you look at the sort of per capita incomes, which economies had the strongest increase in per capita incomes? Was it those that were undergoing massive industrialization? Well, with the exception of China, the answer is no. The ones that were becoming were going up in per capita incomes were typically, Germany and France and the US and Canada and all the rest of it. So what you see is a transformation in how global capital is working from a situation in which industrialization is seen as a good way to become wealthy and the top dog, to industrialization becoming okay, you're the one who's producing the value, we're appropriating it. So we get a rebalancing of the global economy. Now, the one exception in this case is China, which of course used the labor intensity to start to grow, and has managed to do that. But it's so interesting to me that China now has this whole kind of policy of moving away from labor intensity to capital intensity. And so it's well in advance of things like artificial intelligence and all this kind of thing right now. So, and it announced that it was going to be a capital-intensive economy by 2025. Well, it's probably not going to make that for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the United States is hell-bent on stopping them. And I sometimes wonder where it is coming from, because why would the United States be hell-bent on stopping China becoming capital-intensive? Unless the United States understood that capital intensity was the position of advantage in the global economy, and that it wants to preserve its capital intensity vis-a-vis China, because as soon as China becomes as capital intensive as the United States, the transfer of value that occurs through the equalization of the rate of profit is going to disappear. I think it's already disappearing, actually, from China, because China is becoming much more capital intensive. And it's interesting that it's offshoring a lot of the labor-intensive stuff to Cambodia and Laos. It's trying to do it to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese are resisting. It's trying to do it also to some degree through Africa and even through Bangladesh. So it wants to get rid of the labor intensity. And in part because it's running into labor shortages and things of that kind, and its advantage is not there. So yeah, there's this transformation which has occurred, and also the transformation picked up strongly with the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement, because the Bretton Woods system actually created a series of barriers to the equalization of the rate of profit. That is, if you look at the automobile industry worldwide in, say, 1960s, each country had its automobile industry. The Germans did, the Italians did, the French did, the Brits did, the USA did. And there was not an equalization of profit between all of those automobile industries. They were sort of, there was an equalization of profit within the state, but not between states. Then after the sort of collapse of Bretton Woods arrangements, there starts to be a kind of equalization of the rate of profit in the automobile industry across the whole world. It begins to get that way. It never gets there perfectly, but you start to see that happening. So there are these two transformations. One is the power of industrialism to be the heart of capital accumulation, which comes to an end really around 1945, and then picks up and becomes less and less significant after, and particularly in the 1960s. And then there's the big transition towards a neoliberal global order, where there's an equalization of the profit rate going on, which is actually very advantageous to those countries which have capital intensive industrial structures. And I always like the example of Singapore. Singapore in 1964 is sort of thrown out of the Malaysian Federation. And they sit around and they say, what the hell are they going to do? And they had a choice to either join the Soviet bloc, which at that time was a viable option, and they had a strong sort of leanings to do that, or take the capitalist path. So they decided to take the capitalist path, but not the capitalist path of labor intensity. So from the very get-go, they went for capital intensity, and per capita incomes in Singapore are far higher than they are in Bangladesh and all the rest of it. Everybody else happy with the comments?
David, I have go ahead, Christopher, and then I have a question from the chat.
Hi, so I guess my question is, so you described this kind of narrative about industrialization and then how that goes kind of elsewhere, but the benefits of it don't. And I guess I'm wondering kind of the story before industrialization and its connections with like slavery and how that ties into the transfer of like labor power and kind of capital accumulation, as like slavery playing a role in places industrializing.
Well, I think the case of slavery and that early period, you're dealing with you know, the economics of primitive accumulation and if you like, biased appropriation. I mean, you're dealing with robbery and thievery, straight out. Merchant capital was kind of going to places and buying cheap and selling dear, and you know, so you get a lot of transfers of value going on during the pre-industrial period. But those transfers of value are more coming from robbery of the global economy by merchant capital. And that is more blatant and more obvious. And so we can go back and we can look at that and say, well, you know, basically what was happening was the Spaniards were going off and just taking all the gold out of South America, and you know, it was basically stealing, robbery, thievery, violent appropriation. So the inequalities which existed then were more due to those forms of appropriation and violence. And so that was very important in the original accumulation of capital. But what we've been dealing with since 1945 has been a situation where, yeah, some of that could go on, still go on around the world. It wasn't as if it ever stopped. And I talk about that as accumulation by dispossession in contemporary circumstances. So that still goes on, but the more important form of value transfer is, in my view, particularly after the mid-1970s and the abandonment of Bretton Woods, has been through the equalization of the rate of profit. And again, you know, you could see what was going on with merchant capital, what they were doing. I mean, they were, you know, bombarding Goa and, you know, robbing things, and so it's all terribly visible. Whereas the thing about the equalization of the rate of profit is it's not easily visible, and you know, and of course it's not really discussed. It certainly is not discussed in classical political economy, or even certainly not in neoclassical economics.
There is a quick question from the chat. In the phrase equalization of the rate of profit, what components are approaching equal status?
Well, it's a market thing, and you go into the market with a commodity, and you sell it at its value, and its value is you know, constant capital plus variable capital plus the surplus value. And it's that point of the realization of value which becomes significant here. So when it's an equalization of the rate of profit, it says that you're going to sell not according to the value, but you're going to sell according to constant capital, variable capital, and the average rate of profit, because capital is profit oriented, and if I am getting a lower rate of profit than you, then I'm likely to switch my trade and go to your trade because you're getting a higher profit. So wherever the profit rate is highest, you're likely to find capital mobility going on. Now, capital mobility is limited. It's easy when it's in money form. It's hard when it's in production form. So yes, there is a component there of early on in terms of the capacity to move capital from one sector of production to another. That is not always easy when one sector of production has a lot of fixed capital embedded in it, and it's very difficult to move. But the general principle is that if you are in a sector where the profit rate is extremely low, at some point or other, you'll take your monetary profit and bit by bit disinvest from your own activity and reinvest in the sector where the rate of profit is higher. So yes, there's a difficulty of moving from one sector to another, or from one type of corporation to another, or from one country to another when the structures are very different. So these things take some time to work out, but by and large, we're going to see the capital mobility moving from one sector to another according to wherever the rate of profit is highest. And that's only ever a tendency. It's never as if it always is working out, because conditions for the rate of profit are constantly changing. Any other kind of comments? Do people get what's going on here? I mean, some of you who are silent, are you kind of, was it clear what's at stake here?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's becoming clear. I think your explanations were really helpful. I know that like this falling rate of profit business is kind of one of the hardest, at least for me, like one of the hardest parts of Marxist theory to actually like internalize and understand. But I do feel like I'm starting to understand it. One question that I have still is kind of about the intellectual property that you sort of just touch on in your piece, and kind of, yeah, the topology of social infrastructure and perhaps like intellectual labor. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with Mackenzie Wark and her theory of the victorialist class, and kind of how that, yeah, I guess I'm not quite clear. I have a vague idea of how the falling rate of profit kind of is connected to this, you know, speaking of stealing and thievery, essentially, but how that all relates to like intellectual property and yeah.
Well, the thing that strikes me, and why I connected it back to Sohn Rethel and so on, is that if you have capital intensive forms of development, you have to have a labor force that can correspond to that. And there is then the kind of question of, okay, who trains that labor force, and who bears the cost of that training of that labor force? And the United States has been a global pirate in this form. I mean, the United States has not invested in education to the same degree that even places like India have done. So you need a sophisticated labor force that is well trained in, say, software development. And where do you go? They're not around very much in the United States. You go to India, and you get, so suddenly you find whole groups of Indian migrants in Silicon Valley and in places where Walmart are based, because in the sense the United States does not want to bear the costs of training. So it has engineered brain drains. I mean, I'm a product of this. I'm a brain drainer. I was educated for free in Britain, right? All the way through to my PhD. I was state funded and with bursary and all the rest of it. So you know, in terms of my training, it was all done by the British state. And if there are benefits that come from my training, they've been transferred now to the United States. So I guess the United States would wish I would go back, but you know, that's another question. But when after World War II, I mean, who ran the NASA program? It was von Braun, who was the rocket scientist, the chief rocket scientist in Germany. And after World War II, they just rounded up all those guys and picked them up and said, okay, forget about war crimes and all those kinds of things. We'll just take you straight to Florida. And you're the ones who are going to give us NASA and all the rest of it. So the United States has always been economizing on the cost of reproduction of labor power and the production of labor power. And therefore has lived by brain drains. And it's astonishing. I mean, if you go into any hospital in New York City and you look at the doctors and where they come from, a lot of them come from South Asia, a lot of them come from Africa. I mean, there's this incredible drain of talent. I mean, it even occurs within countries. I mean, this is one of the big problems of Puerto Rico's situation. I mean, anybody who has kind of advanced talent and that is drawn off into the United States and works in the United States. So I think that the whole kind of question of the labor force and where does the labor force come from, and we'll talk about this more when I get it, if and when I get into the question of social reproduction, because this is a terribly important aspect of the global economy. I mean, in terms of basic education in what's it called, the sort of mathematics, the STEM sciences, the basic training of STEM sciences in the United States. And the United States stands about, I don't know, 20th or 30th in the world in terms of quality of education in the STEM sciences. Well, it can do that because it can actually buy in and will continue presumably to buy in the labor force to match the capital intensity that it's pushing. And a lot of that capital intensity is created by people who come from a low income part of the world, where if they stayed and so this is again the inequality. So it's not simply the equalization of the rate of profit. It's also this bias in production of labor power, and which is adequate to a high level of capital intensity. And so the United States is a very strange country in the sense that you find highly trained people, some of them highly trained in the United States because the research universities are, but when you're in the research universities and you go to, I mean, I was at Johns Hopkins, which was a very research-oriented university, and when you go to lunch in, I don't know, Earth and Planetary Sciences or Hubble telescope or something like that, you won't find hardly a single American around. They're all Asiatic, or actually in space sciences, a lot of them are Russian. I mean, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the highly technical, space scientists and so on in Russia just emigrated to various parts of the world, including in the United States. So if you went into the Hubble telescope, which they have in Johns Hopkins, and you had lunch, and the lingua franca was Russian. Everybody's speaking Russian. So it's basically the whole research emphasis was based on that. So this seems to me to be one of the things that needs to be looked at in relationship to this equalization of the rate of profit, because the equalization of the rate of profit deals with the organization of industrial structure, but then you've got to find a labor force which is corresponding to that industrial structure. And if it's not set up locally, it's going to have to be by essentially raiding the planet for brain drains, producing a very peculiar kind of structure within the population of highly educated technicians and so on, who have a certain way of understanding the world, and a lot of rather badly educated people who form the mass of the population, which is where the United States is at, because public education is inferior in the United States compared to a lot of most European countries, and even inferior to some developing countries. Any other kind of questions guys got? We don't have too many people logged on today. I don't know why. Probably sitting in their bomb shelters or something.
I guess I just jump in, Professor, if you don't mind, with one more
Yeah.
follow-up. Is if the transfer of value was not, if you weren't able to identify an aspect of Marx's theory that accounted for or helped to make sense of the transfer of value through, what is the kind of upshot, or what is if it was just the tendency of people, if the corporate structure, if people, they closed factories and they moved the equipment, whether it was from the northeast of the US to the south of the US in an earlier period, or from the global north to the global south, and it was, if there was no law in Marx's theory that kind of made sense of that, is there a way in which identifying it as a tendency or law allows us to approach it more constructively than if it was just bad actions on the part of people who were interested in exploiting labor so that they could, because the individual capitalists, they don't understand that they're following a Marxian law when they close a factory and offshore the labor.
No, right, but yeah, again, one of the things I can't remember, I probably said it right at the very beginning, is this idea that, as capital develops, so we increasingly become governed by abstractions. And that therefore our ability to understand the world is very much colored by the degree to which we can come to terms with the abstractions which are at work. And what Marx is good at, it seems to me, is to sort of try to talk about the earthiness and the materialist, historical materialist nature of these abstractions and how they come about, and with what effects. And I think this is terribly, this is what I find so interesting about Marx, because when I say that we don't see the equalization of the rate of profit, and we don't see its effects in any kind of immediate way, we assume the ideological thing that the market is egalitarian and fair, and then we sit there in the bathing in the glory of equality and freedom, only to find that actually that equality and freedom is about the production of inequality and unfreedom. And this is, in a sense, where Marx is going. And then there's the sort of issue of what to do about it. Well, we kind of go, okay, we can have a complete revolution and all the rest of it. But one of the things that I think is, one of the implications of this argument is that I think the world was a much better organized place when there were capital controls. And that therefore the reinstitution of capital controls, which is absolutely abhorrent to almost every economist you ever come across, the institution of is a very good thing and a very good idea. And it's interesting, the one case I know where capital controls worked and did so in an emergency was in 2008, when there was a financial crisis. And the one place that instituted capital controls was Malaysia. And the result of having capital controls was that somehow or other it was protected against the worst aspects of what happened during that crisis. And so some people started to say, well, maybe more general capital controls would be a good idea. But I'm not being romantic about the Bretton Woods period because there are all sorts of problems with it. But one of the positive things about it was that capital controls meant that the state was enclosed in its own structures which allowed labor to organize. So unions could organize, and it would then make sense then to talk about the British working class and the French working class, and they could develop political parties, and you could get social democracy and all those kinds of things. So you get all those things operating in the 1960s, an institutional structure which allows for a greater egalitarianism of distribution of the product, as well as an egalitarianism of sharing in the cost of production of so it's a more egalitarian phase. And it's the anti-egalitarianism that got set up in the sort of neoliberal phase of the 1970s, where, you know, the economists started to say, you know, this is very bad, it's not working, you know, blah, we're lacking freedom of, you know, and coming off the 68 uprisings and all the rest of it, somehow or other, the world had to be transformed. And so it gets transformed in the neoliberal revolution of the 1970s, 1980s. And you abolish capital controls, and what do you get? You get what's going on in the world right now. Because back in the Bretton Woods period, there was not the same degree of transfer of value coming out through the market system, because the market system was partitioned, if you like, between these different markets. So I'm very much in favor of reintroducing some level of capital controls to try to quieten this stuff down. I mean, this is a social democratic argument, it's not a revolutionary one, but on the other hand, I think social democracy is better than what we've got right now, which is sort of neo-fascistic neoliberalism, you know. So like I say, one of the things would be, and you find certain hints of, you know, capital controls and ideas about capital controls coming back in Latin America right now. There's some sort of talk of reinstituting what they had during the 1960s, which was the infant industry protectionism and import substitution, which was kind of not about globalization, the present sort. So we could have different policies. And I think if everybody understood this stuff about the equalization of the rate of profit and the damage it does in terms of the generating of global inequalities, I think that we might end up with a different kind of set of ideas in the world, which might reorganize institutions around different principles. I mean, anybody else got any kind of comments? Coco, you all okay?
Sorry, I'm having some Wi-Fi issues, but yeah, all is good. I find it's better when I have my camera off, so.
Oh yeah, no, it sometimes is.
Yeah, but thank you.
Okay. Anybody else want to say something? Who hasn't said anything?
Yeah, David, we have one more question from the chat.
Okay.
What role do historical structures, so institutions, laws, business partnerships, colonial legacies, etc., play in supporting or challenging the equalization of the rate of profit?
Well, yeah, the answer is they play a role. I can't tell you what the role specifically is. I think it's the kind of thing you have to investigate. I think, you know, yeah, very often, I'm not saying this lies behind the questioner, but very, very often people become very concerned with what the theory does not tell you. And the question there is a valid question. It's an important question. It's one that had to be worked out historically and so on. And I think that I don't have a sort of complete answer to it, and would need to investigate and think about it and all the rest of it. But what I think it's important to do is to not lose sight of what it is that Marx has uncovered. I mean, there's this kind of notion that somehow he covered everything and he did everything, that therefore if he can't explain, what's happening in South Africa versus what's happening in Brazil in 1926, he's useless. No, I don't think that's how we should be looking at it. What we should be looking at is saying, what does this tell us about the present situation? And what does this tell us that then leads us to start to rethink how we're understanding the present situation? And I think the equalization of the rate of profit is one of those points where you start to have a different realization of, and to be suspicious. For example, people who make the claim that free markets are egalitarian and good. Well, yes, there is a certain equality principle at work in exchange, but there is the problem of the inequality of outcomes. And I think this is a sort of an interesting case where I sometimes talk about Marx, that the greatest inequality comes from that equality which produces the inequality. There's nothing. He has this sort of term in a way of, I'm reducing his terminology, that there's nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. And you think about that for the moment, and then you realize how important a principle that is. Because the equal treatment of unequals, everybody can kind of say, it's egalitarian, it's fine. But when you start out with tremendous inequalities and then you do an equal treatment of those inequalities, you simply get more inequality. Which is why this stuff about rates and masses becomes terribly important. So I think it's important to understand what it is that what kinds of abstractions we're engaging with, and what we're learning, and how that can shape our thinking about particular issues. And I find myself doing that all the time, like this Ukraine stuff. I wrote some stuff about the Ukraine thing coming out of these principles. And it doesn't tell you the whole story. In fact, it doesn't, there's a lot of things that need to be supplemented, and people subsequently sort of supplemented it. But it was important to have the nature of the argument down and get the nature of the argument correct. And when you can do that via things like the whole kind of rates and masses kind of question, and the equalization of the rate of profit question, these kinds of questions, if you can understand them and bring them to bear on a particular situation, then of course you're going to find it doesn't fit like a glove. It's all messy and difficult, but nevertheless you've got some anchorage in terms of a map, if you like, that can guide you a little bit into how to deal with the particular situation. Maybe I'll do some of that right at the end of the course. So, are there any other questions? Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, Professor. I think you probably have answered this question already, but it's just a part that I'm struggling with. Maybe you can repeat a little bit again. I think I understand the equalization of the rate of profit, and a little bit what can be done about that. Like you said, partitioning off the global economy can reduce the equalization of the rate of profit to those smaller segments rather than across the entire globe. I'm still struggling with the actual how the actual transfer of value between capital intensive to labor intensive is happening. And I think maybe what would be helpful is there anything that can be done about that? If you could describe the instrument of what's happening, and maybe also what can be done to respond to that. I think that would help me zero in on what the dynamic is that's causing that transfer of value.
Well, I
Thank
think
you.
that, yeah, the difficulty here is that when you're dealing with value transfers, you're dealing with something which is immaterial but objective. That is in the same way that you, if I tell you about the gross domestic product or something like that, and I say it's worth $90 trillion, and you then say, where's the $90 trillion? In which bank is it located? And the answer is it's not located in any bank. It's just there as $90 trillion worth of activity. And therefore you don't, it's not as if I can actually trace the transfers. I can only figure out their effects. And when I look for the effects, what do I see? I see Bangladesh developing a very vibrant economy around labor-intensive production, particularly of clothing and textiles. So I see that going on, and I see the conditions of life of the working people in this place. And I asked the question which was asked earlier: how come this massive industrialization has not led to an increase in per capita incomes, to a radical increase in per capita incomes? Why is Bangladesh not now as wealthy as the United States? Because it's got enough labor to have been doing that. So why is that happening? And then I go and I get to the kind of case that Marx mentions in the Grundrisse, where he kind of says, well, imagine a company that has no laborers, or so few laborers that it almost doesn't count. How come that it gets the average rate of profit? And I look around and I see a lot of capital intensive economies that are pulling in huge rates of profit. And actually, you can actually see it within the commodity chain. For example, Apple is, in a sense, a merchant capitalist economy with a let's call it a sort of a domination over design and science and design. Where are the Apple phones and computers produced? Well, they're produced in Shenzhen. And you see a huge labor force in Shenzhen of maybe 400,000 people in one sort of factories. And then behind that, there lie all of the producers of the parts, like the chips and all this kind of thing. So you have a long commodity chain going back. And then you kind of say, what's the rate of profit on of all those companies in the commodity chain, and what's Apple's rate of profit? Well, according to the Financial Times, Apple, I don't know which year it was, 2019 or something like that, Apple's rate of profit was something like 26%. Foxconn, which is employing those 400,000 laborers, its rate of profit was around 3%. So you kind of go, well, actually, here's a commodity chain which starts with labor-intensive stuff, and then it goes to the capital-intensive part of it, which is Apple, and they're getting far higher rate of. And now this is pure extraction, and there were attacks upon Apple, and Apple was asked to be more conscious about the conditions of labor of the people in the commodity chain, and it said it would, and it sent people and delegations to East Asia and elsewhere in the world where the commodity chain. But if you're interested, you can go to a place called Labor Watch, China Labor Watch, I think it's called. And they occasionally put people into employment in one of these things and find out what the rights are and what their payment is and what happens with overtime and all that kind of thing. So they get reports coming up commodity chain as to what labor conditions are. So this is, if you like, a material representation of these value transfers, because the value transfer is essentially coming to Apple personnel, many of whom are in the United States, and they're living off the hog, whereas the people who are down in the trenches creating the value are back there in China and then back down the commodity chains. So you could sometimes get a sense of it that way. But it's hard to deal with the abstractions. I agree. You know, I mean, the abstractions are there, and the value transformations are there, and the effects are there. So I'm betting that, given the way the world is worked, that further industrialization in Bangladesh is not going to improve its conditions in terms of the per capita income. Whereas if it wants to go somewhere, it should get like Singapore, which went the other way. And yeah. Okay. Well, we should probably start now on the other part of the class, which is session class for session 7. And this has the peculiar title of Masses in Motion. And the idea of this is that in the same way that we can look at the contradictions entailed in the falling rate of profit, it's also, and to do that without concern for anything else, including the mass of profit, it's also possible to isolate the question of the rising mass and to talk about the contradictions within the rising mass. And so what I'm attempting to do here is to do for the rising mass what has been earlier done for the rising, for the falling rate. And I start off with Marx's kind of language, where Marx, even in his day, was prone to talk about the increasingly monstrous mass of value and surplus value in circulation, along with the increasing physical mass of use values required for the reproduction of capital. And he is suggesting that this ought to be in the forefront of contemporary concerns, and that is why I'm giving a particular session on that. Because this increasing mass of everything threatens to exhaust possibilities for endlessly accumulating capital, and stresses and cracks in the fabric of this continuous expansionism of value and of product spark periodic crises. The rising mass seriously compromises the very existence of humanity's already tenuous lifestyle, if not humanity itself on planet Earth. If there are global harms strongly in evidence, environmental, social, and political, and it doesn't take, I think, much for me to persuade you that there are, then one of the prime engines of such harms surely lies with the problems of the rising mass. And to emphasize this point, I set up a number of bullet points simply to illustrate the dimensions of the problem. The World Bank data on global gross domestic product, adjusted to constant 2011 dollars, give us 9.25 trillion in 1950, rising to 34.7 trillion in 1980, 63.1 trillion by 2000, and 94.9 trillion by 2011, which is the end of when this study was done. So there was a more than tenfold increase in GDP since 1950. And in the text, I put figure 3, I'll find a figure to show that. This raises the question of how can such a compounding rate of growth be sustained into the future? Furthermore, in 1980, about 10% of global GDP involved exports, but that had risen before the pandemic struck to around a quarter of GDP, global GDP, by 2019. Can that expansion in supply chains be resumed? Second bullet point. The capital value of Apple, the world's largest corporation, topped 3 trillion in 2021. Elon Musk's personal wealth increased from 25 billion to 150 billion during the pandemic. This is just the tip of the iceberg of astonishing centralization of wealth and power in a few hands, both private and corporate. The world's central bankers injected 9 trillion into economies to counteract COVID-19, most of which ended up in the pockets of the ultra-rich oligarchs. The total wealth of billionaires worldwide rose by 5 trillion to 13 trillion in 12 months. The world's wealthiest 1% took 38% of all additional wealth accumulated since the mid-1990s. And the global population of billionaires rose more than 5-fold. Just 2% of the increase in wealth after the mid-1990s went to the bottom 50%. Item 3. For the last 800,000 years, the concentrations of carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere had never been greater than 300 parts per million. Since 1960, it has risen continuously through expanding fossil fuel use to circa 430 parts per million in 2021. The result has been a strong uptick in global warming and sea level rise, with all manner of attendant climatic and biological disruptions. While the continuing rate of emissions of greenhouse gases is a serious problem, the mass of CO2 already in the atmosphere is now enough to cause major disruptions over the next 3 decades without any further additions. The Antarctic and Greenland ice masses could well disappear during these 30 years, and also the Himalayan snowpack, which would turn the Ganges into a seasonal river with all kinds of disastrous consequences for Indian water supply. Item 4. The output of plastics has grown, particularly since plastic bottles strong enough to contain carbonated drinks were introduced in 1973, at a compound rate above 8% per annum. 80% of the cumulative output of plastics since 1950, some 8,000 million tons, now lies in landfills, in the oceans, or in the atmosphere as microplastic polymers produced by plastic decomposition with exposure to sunlight, with unknown health effects. Much of the world's potable water, of course, is now delivered in plastic containers. Item 5. Between 2011 and 2013, China consumed 45% more cement than the US consumed over 100 years. During those 2 years, China led the world in economic growth, thus saving the world from economic recession by spreading cement everywhere in a massive construction boom that unparalleled in human history. Incidentally, the production of cement is a major greenhouse gas emitter. Item 6. The number of airline trips increased from 1.2 billion in 1980 to 4.6 billion in 2019 before being cut short by the pandemic. Item 7. The International Monetary Fund often complains at the surpluses of liquidity sloshing around in the world's money markets. The rising mass of money seeking opportunities for productive investment is harder and harder to accommodate. And I do have a graph somehow where or other of the total global money supply, which is, of course, an exponential growth curve. Now, all of these examples can easily be multiplied, but all of them, directly or indirectly, I would submit, are related to each other, and all can be viewed as a product of the law of ever-increasing mass, irrespective of the rate. To seriously seek to confront or even merely regulate any of these masses requires taking on the process that is producing them, and that process is the double-edged law of the falling rate and rising mass. But in the same way that it is possible to analyze the contradictions of the falling rate without too much regard for the rising mass, so it is useful to analyze the contradictions of the rising mass without much regard for the falling rate. The variety of examples listed above, for example, suggest that any attempt to curb a rising mass in one sphere can easily be compensated for by expansion in the mass elsewhere. The world is now increasingly engulfed, it seems, in an indigestible mass, a physical output, and of value. To start with, however, we have to recognize that the masses can perform in themselves as an economic instrument. This should not be surprising. When a mass takes on the money form, then it is a claim upon future labor. And that means it is also a critical source and measure of social power. Jeff Bezos founded Amazon in 1994. He saw an opening in the emergent field of logistics, in which the aim was to rationalize distribution and to create efficiencies of circulation, while capturing valuable data on individual consumer wants, needs, and desires sufficient to anticipate, forecast, as well as to shape consumer preferences. His company went public in 1996, but did not make a profit, and even then a very trivial one, until 2001. During these 7 non-profit years, coincidentally those of the dot-com boom, Bezos kept both the hope of success and the confidence of investors alive by rapidly increasing the mass of turnover, increasing the scale of his business enterprise and the spread of his distributional network. The dot-com crash of 2001 brought down quite a few speculative ventures. Enron and long-term capital management were the 2 spectacular precursors in 1998. Which is why Amazon's declaration of a profit, however small, in 2001 was so symbolically important. To the extent that Bezos was selling change of location, productive labor in Marx's view, his enterprise created value. But his pathway to profitability lay through the increasing mass, which later anchored Amazon's rising monopoly power in the world market. By 2010, Amazon was big enough to have left behind the coercive laws of competition and to enjoy the privileges of oligopoly. Bezos had obeyed the first law of capital's political economy, as Marx defined it, of producing as much mass of surplus value as possible, regardless of the rate of profit. Many corporations, for this reason, strive to become too big to fail. That is what kept Boeing alive after the catastrophic losses deriving from the 2 crashes of its new line of aircraft, the 737 MAX, in 2018 and 2019. The hegemonic position of the United States in the world after 1945 was founded on the superior economic mass rather than on its rate of growth. China's challenge lies in increasing its economic mass by a high rate of growth on an ever-increasing mass. The last part of the manuscript version of Marx's chapter on the falling rate of profit takes up some of these issues created by the rising mass of value and of product. Engels called these contradictions within the law, but the proper title should have been Contradictions of the Rising Mass. Marx takes up issues of overproduction, underconsumption, overaccumulation, and what he calls a plethora of capital, periodically plaguing capital accumulation because the rising mass gets out of control. It is as if capital is perpetually seeking to go beyond in terms of the rising mass. Marx recognizes, of course, that the production of the mass is limited by the available labor force. This is a matter we have already considered. The production of surplus value is, as always, the immediate purpose and the determining motive of capitalist production. But Marx now interjects, and this is him speaking, it is only the first act. It remains to be completed. And here I quote Marx at some length, the total products must be sold. If this does not happen, or happens only partly, or at prices that are less than the price of production, then although the worker is certainly exploited, his exploitation is not realized as such for the capitalist, and may involve the partial or complete loss of his capital or a merely partial realization of the surplus value that is being extorted. This confirms the point Marx makes at the very beginning of Capital, in the first few pages. Nothing, he says, can be of value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, then so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. What Marx is pointing to here is what he calls the contradictory unity between the production and realization of value. And this moves center stage in his theorization of capital's nature and his specification of capital's laws of motion and of becoming. By the time we get to the end of the original manuscript on the falling rate of profit, it seems that problems of realization and of absorbing the increasing mass are just as, if not more significant than those deriving from the falling rate of profit. Marx ends the chapter with some tentative observations on the plethora of capital, overproduction of commodities, and overaccumulation, the tendency towards what he calls the perpetual overaccumulation of capital as a precursor to crisis formation. Crises, he suggests, are never more than momentary, violent solutions for the existing contradictions, violent eruptions that re-establish the balance that has been disturbed. The balance between production of value within the labor process and the realization of value in the market is in perpetual need of adjustment, and clearly any major imbalance here will disrupt the totality of capital and put it in crisis. Marx elsewhere more fulsomely describes world trade crises as the real concentration and forcible adjustment of all the contradictions of bourgeois economy. The individual factors, like realization, which are condensed in these crises, must therefore emerge and must be described in each sphere of the bourgeois economy. And the further we advance in our examination of the latter, the more aspects of the conflict must be traced on the one hand, and on the other it must be shown that its more abstract forms are occurring and are contained in the more concrete forms. The underlying balance is largely determined by, of course, the double-edged law of rate and mass, which in turn hinges on the contradictory relation between production and realization of surplus value within the continuous production and circulation of capital. This is how Marx's inquiry into the falling rate of profit concludes. This is very different from the starting point. Clearly, the interdependency of the mass-rate relation counts for much more than the standalone theory of the falling rate of profit, which in any case cannot function without connection to the contradictory unity of production and realization. Now, conservative Marxists, that is those who stick in a certain kind of orthodoxy, tend to dismiss any focus on realization as Keynesian, which for some reason or other is often ruled out as illegitimate or even specious. Even to mention it is, in some Marxist circles, to depart from the scientific theory of the falling rate of profit and the large body of empirical evidence adduced to support it, in favor of promoting an illegitimate underconsumptionist theory of crisis formation. The rigidity of this positivist reading fails to acknowledge the importance of rising mass and problems of its absorption or disposal in Marx's thinking. While the production of surplus value is restricted only by society's productive forces, quoting Marx, the realization is restricted, and again I'm quoting, by the proportionality between the different branches of production and by the society's power of consumption. And this is determined neither by the absolute power of production nor by the absolute power of consumption, but rather by the power of consumption on the basis of antagonistic conditions of distribution, which reduce the consumption of those who form the bedrock of society. He is obviously referring here to the working classes, that the consumption of this bedrock of society is restricted to a minimal level, restricted within more or less narrow limits. While individual capitalists seek to drive their wages down, they hope everyone else will raise wages to promote a vibrant, effective demand in the market for their products. The contradiction between the thorough exploitation of labor power and cultivating the consumption capacity of the wage laborers is omnipresent. I quote again from Marx. A development of the productive forces that would reduce the absolute number of workers, thus enabling the whole nation to accomplish its entire production in a shorter period of time, would produce a revolution, because it would deprive the majority of the population of its income and also of its purchasing power. I'm quoting Marx there. The division between final consumption and productive consumption, new investments, is here significant. The two play to the beat of a different drummer. The conditions of realization are affected by the drive for accumulation, drive to expand capital and to produce surplus value on a larger scale. The laws of reinvestment derive from constant revolutions in the methods of production themselves, from the depreciation of the existing capital, which is always associated with this, from the general competitive struggle and the necessity to improve production and extend its scale on pain of death, merely as a means of self-preservation. The expansion of final consumption, on the other hand, requires the market must continually be extended, so that its relationships and the conditions governing them assume ever more the form of a natural law, independent of the producers, and become ever more uncontrollable. And now notice this idea about, and it becomes a natural law. And that natural law produces globalization, global integrations, global expansions, and all the rest of it. It becomes a natural law in the sense that it becomes embedded in the nature of a capitalist mode of production. The rising mass depends on constantly revolutionizing wants, needs, and desires in human populations. It entails perpetual revolutions in the qualities of daily life and the manufacture of a culture of mass consumerism that envelops all and sundry in its net of engagements, desires, and requirements. Early on, even in the Communist Manifesto, it was recognized that all this would entail the production of the world market, and that some movement towards what is often referred to as globalization would be needed to accommodate the increasing mass of capital accumulation in the commodity form. By the time Marx was writing the Grundrisse, he had understood the consequences of a rising mass of commodity output for the world of consumption. The production of relative surplus value, he writes, requires the production of new consumption, requires the consuming circle within the circulation expands as did the productive circle previously. Firstly, quantitative expansion of existing consumption. Secondly, creation of new needs by propagating existing ones in a wide circle. Thirdly, production of new needs and discovery and creation of new needs and discovery and creation of new use values. The drive towards mass consumption is given within the nature of capital and all of those items which we talked about, production of globalization, new wants and needs and the like. This mass consumption has been revolutionized over the past 40 years of unbridled consumerism. In the 19th century, final consumers in Britain accounted for around 35% of economic activity, as was also the case in China during the 1980s. In the USA, final consumption now accounts for close to 70% of the economy, and China is rapidly catching up. Indices of consumer confidence are closely watched in the business press, since they often presage economic booms or the onset of recessions. Even Marx accepted that consumption can sometimes incentivize production, just as production creates new conditions of consumption. The typical working class household in Marx's time was poorly equipped with consumer durables. At the most, it would have had a kitchen range fired by wood, coal, or charcoal, a few pots and pans, a table, some chairs, elementary cutlery and crockery, oil lamps and bedding. Households of this sort can still be found in much of the developing world, but in high-income countries, the range of consumer durables is huge by comparison. Stoves, refrigerators, dishwashers, washing machines, cooking equipment, coffee makers, vacuum cleaners, bedding, TV and radio, digital devices, often a car with growing rates of home ownership. Electricity, gas, piped water, and adequate sewage disposal are standard. All this constitutes an enormous and ever-growing market for surplus product. When Marx addressed the prospects for invention becoming a business, he did not foresee the degree to which innovation would be oriented to the creation of new product lines, new needs and desires, even whole lifestyles, such as that of the suburban nuclear family. It is this that has helped to make final consumer demand the chief driver of the economy in high-income countries. The governor of the San Francisco Federal Reserve once commented that the US typically gets out of crises by building houses and filling them with things. Consumer durables make the consumption fund a vital core of capital's expansion, supported by a falling rate of interest on consumer loans since 1980. US interest rates have fallen from around 15 to under 2%. Capitalist production also aims to support consumption rates by building in as much short-termism and planned obsolescence as possible, as with failing cell phones and laptops. It has only produced use values that lasted over 100 years. If it only produced use values that lasted over 100 years, like my grandmother's knives and forks, made in Sheffield in the 1890s and which I still use, this market would be sluggish in the extreme. There has also been a phenomenal growth in recent times in forms of consumerism, where the commodity is not a thing, but an experience instantaneously consumed. This, on the surface, seems to propose a mode of consumption that is far less demanding and environmentally friendly than the making of things such as automobiles and bicycles. Culture, sport, and other spectacular events have been created or appropriated and monetized by capital, with online cultural consumption flourishing during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, international tourism expanded dramatically to global industry. Cross-border trips rose from 800 million in 2008 to 1.4 billion in 2018. In this case, what is being marketed is the experience of other cultures, even if it hollows them out in the process. Instantaneous consumption of this sort, the reduction of turnover time of actual consumption to almost nothing, requires, however, large-scale investment in physical infrastructures, airports, planes, cruise ships, ports, highways, hotels, stadia, as well as myriad cultural institutions, art galleries, concert halls, sports arenas, gardens, and restaurants. The Netflix economy requires serious ancillary investments, both upstream in the production of TV series and downstream in the transmission towers and reception equipment, TV screens and household electronics, all of which get monetized, monopolized, and capitalized by the streaming organizations. Cruise liners, to take another field of rapidly growing experiential consumerism, employ a lot of labor and entail vast investments in fixed capital, including that of an independent kind, ports and harbors. While experiential capitalism in itself makes few direct demands upon raw materials and other environmental goods, it entails the creation of massive infrastructures and a huge labor force to cater consumers' demands, while the destructive social and ecological consequences have provoked anti-tourism movements from Venice and Barcelona to Machu Picchu. These negative externalities, particularly the impact on the environment, indicate potential barriers to the profitable realization of the surplus value in this form in the future. While Marx could not have possibly imagined the immense mass and scale of today's consumerism, nor anticipated the role of consumers in powering growth and defining lifestyles by their choices, his prescient language points to a directionality in capital's historical geography that makes such outcomes plausible and possible, and I quote him. As soon as the general conditions of production appropriate to large-scale industry have been established, this mode of production acquires an elasticity, a capacity for sudden extension by leaps and bounds, which come up against no barriers but those presented by the availability of raw materials and the extent of sales outlets. Mass production, most prominently represented in Marx's times by the Manchester system, generated a rapidly expanding demand for raw materials and an intensification of the violence of extractivism back down the supply chain, putting immense pressure on raw material producers all around the world. Mass production had to be paralleled by mass consumption to absorb the increasing quantity of product. This meant an increase in the wage labor force to function as final consumers of reconfigurations of lifestyle and rising per capita incomes for significant segments of the population. This also meant creating the world market. And there's a long quote from the Communist Manifesto on that topic. But here there is a significant complication. The conditions for immediate exploitation and for the realization of that exploitation are not identical. Not only are they separate in time and space, they are conceptually separate. This is Marx talking. Apple computers and iPhones designed in California are assembled in Shenzhen by Foxconn, a Taiwanese firm, out of parts that come from all over the world. Much of the value and surplus value is realized by Apple through sales in North American and European markets. But the value is produced not only in China, but all around the world. The Financial Times reports that Foxconn, the principal direct producer, has a profit rate of some 3%, while Apple, the designer and merchant capitalist, gets more than 25%. But with 1.5 million workers employed throughout China, Foxconn commands a rapidly expanding mass of capital while producing massive quantities of surplus value, even though its stated rate of monetary profit is low. Foxconn produces, along with its suppliers, the value and surplus value employing a huge mass of workers. Apple realizes and appropriates much of the surplus value produced by Foxconn and others with a far smaller labor force. But almost a third of Apple's market lies in China. And in recent times, that market has fallen off in part because of competition from Chinese producers. Apple's stock market valuation was hit badly in 2019 when anti-US sentiment in China led to a semi-boycott of Apple products. Its capacity to appropriate surplus value in China fell and Apple's stock market valuation plunged. The value transfers produced through the equalization of the rate of profit are here supplemented by our divergent powers to realize and appropriate the surplus value relative to the firms, sectors, and regions which organize the production of the surplus value. It is still the case that China produces far more surplus value than it appropriates, while the US appropriates far more than it produces. And this all occurs over and beyond the regional and sectoral inequalities visited upon the trading world by the equalization of the rate of profit, all of which heightens the contradiction between the conditions in which surplus value is produced and the conditions in which it is realized. There are further complications with respect to the organization and spreading importance of productive consumption as a distinctive field of realization of capital value. As the profit rate falls, Marx observes, so the capital minimum for investment in search of a rising mass grows. The minimum is the level of concentration of the means of production in the hands of the individual capitalists, seeking to employ more labor and increase the mass in spite of the falling rate. This minimum necessarily has to increase in pursuit of ever-increasing mass. That is, to go into business these days, you need to have a lot of upfront capital to get into it. The result is increased concentration and centralization of capital, which feeds off the way a large capital with a lower rate of profit accumulates more quickly than a small capital with a higher rate of profit. Again, I'm quoting Marx on that. The credit system, which we'll examine in detail later, is the main lever powering what Marx in Volume 1 of Capital calls the laws of increasing centralization of capital. In our own times, the astonishing speed of capital centralization in the high-tech sector, made up of Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, the FANGs, as they are called in the USA, along with Alibaba and Tencent in China. This is level of concentration and speed of it is exemplary of this tendency. The stock market valuation of Netflix, as in the earlier case of Amazon, is tied primarily to its procurement of new subscribers, its increasing mass, rather than to its rate of profit. Chinese banks, it is said, are only interested in size rather than profitability. Hardly surprisingly, the 4 largest banks in the world by far are Chinese, and this in spite of the fact that conventional banking was suspended in China during the Cultural Revolution. The tendency towards greater and greater centralization of the mass is inevitable, Marx argues. Even though there are some strong countercurrents of dispersal and decentralization. State legislation curbing the powers of cartels and monopolies in the economy recognize there is a potential problem of excessive centralization, but the weakness of enforcement suggests that centralizing capital still rules supreme. The centralization of capital is often accomplished at the expense of the smaller producers, which in turn produces a new fall in the rate of profit, at the same time as it produces a plethora of capital facing difficulty in finding productive outlets for investment. The latter condition, again, Marx, quoting Marx, arises from the same causes that stimulate the production of a relative surplus population. This produces the signal sign of a serious crisis of capital, which is, and I quote Marx, unoccupied capital on one hand and an unemployed working population on the other. This was exactly the situation in the Great Depression of the 1930s. The search for relative surplus value through technological and organizational change throws workers out of work, creating technologically induced unemployment. At the same time, it puts a segment of capital out of business, the small-scale producers in particular. They can no longer compete with the large-scale producers. The sight of unemployed capital and unemployed workers side by side in the midst of obvious chronic social needs makes no sense. It is stark testimony to the fundamental irrationality of capital. The outcome is likely to be devaluation. But to explore this requires a major structural shift in how a capitalist mode of production should be construed and represented. One part of the old capital would lose its value completely, entirely ceasing to function as capital. Which section of capital would be subject to annihilation through devaluation would depend on the competitive struggle. When things go well, competition acts as a practical fraternity of the capitalist class, so that they all share in the common booty. But as soon as it is no longer a question of the division of profit, but rather who is to bear the loss, each seeks, as far as he can, to restrict his own share and settle it on somebody else. For the class as a whole, the loss is unavoidable. How much each individual member has to bear now becomes a struggle of enemy brothers. Here we have the enunciation of yet another vitally important insight into Marx's theory of capital. And I quote him, "The opposition between the interest of each individual capitalist and that of the capitalist class as a whole now comes into its own. Individual capitalists, acting in their own self-interest, frequently behave in such a way as to jeopardize reproduction of the capitalist class and the capitalist system. The individual interest and the class interest do not coincide. The balance between these divergent interests can only be restored by the annihilation of capital to a greater or lesser extent. Much will depend, however, on capital's material form. Fixed capital, as we shall later see, may be particularly vulnerable to devaluation in times of crisis, and the distinction between money, commodity, and production capital is also relevant. With this, the whole framing of Marx's theory of the inner structure of capital accumulation undergoes a radical transformation. We have seen how the growing accumulation of capital involves its growing concentration. And I'm quoting Marx here. Thus, the power of capital grows. In other words, the autonomy of the social conditions of production, as personified by the capitalist, is asserted more and more as against the activity of the actual producers. Capital shows itself more and more to be a social power, with the capitalist as its functionary, a power that no longer stands in any kind of relationship to what the work of one particular individual can create. It is instead an alienated social power, which has gained an autonomous position and confronts society as a thing, as the power the capitalist has through this thing. The contradiction between the alienated social power into which capital has developed and the private power of the individual capitalists over the social conditions of production, this contradiction develops even more blatantly, while their development also contains the solution to the situation in that it simultaneously converts the conditions of production into general communal social conditions. This transformation is brought about by the development of the productive forces under capitalist production, and by the manner and form in which their development is accomplished. These are the abstractions which rule over both labor and capital, leaving individual laborers and individual capitalists entirely vulnerable to the performance of these abstractions. This tension between the individual and the class perspective has enormous implications. Marx says, for example, no capitalist voluntarily applies a new method of production, no matter how productive it may be or how much it may raise the rate of surplus value, if it reduces the rate of profit. But every new method of production of this kind makes commodities cheaper. And capitalists can enjoy the individual form of relative surplus value as long as it lasts, while the fall in the rate of profit appears completely independent of the capitalist's will. Individual capitalists gain mightily from the technological advantages that collectively lead to the falling rate of profit. At first blush, this appears a rather complicated argument, but the essence of it is quite simple. Bourgeois economics has never succeeded in reconciling, let alone fusing, economics, the theory of the individual, microeconomics, the theory of the individual firm, and macroeconomic growth theory. But for Marx, this is not a problem to be solved theoretically by contorted manipulations in the realm of ideas. It is a matter of identifying the contradictory practices through which the two perspectives relate. This is the tactic Marx is pursuing here. The ephemeral and micro form of relative surplus value, which individual capitalists seek, produces the macro effect of falling profits behind the backs, as Marx liked to put it, of the direct producers. Marx embraces the contradictions whereas bourgeois political economy seeks to erase them. Bourgeois economics abhors contradictions, just as nature abhors a vacuum. Marx, of course, embraces them. And in this case, what he is embracing is the contradiction of the falling rate and rising mass, which integrates with the contradiction between the production and realization of value. Okay, I've taken us up to 8 o'clock. Sorry, it was a bit long. I'll put it on the web tomorrow, and we'll see what you make of this one. Okay.